The rooftop terrace at Chateau Marmont overlooked the sprawling expanse of West Hollywood, its white linen tables and crystal glasses catching the late morning sunlight. Mom's 58th birthday brunch was everything she'd dreamed of. 40 family members gathered at the most exclusive restaurant in Los Angeles, mimosas flowing like water, and a spread of delicacies that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I sat at the far end of the longest table, picking at my eggs Benedict while conversations swirled around me about vacation homes, stock portfolios and business acquisitions. The Rodriguez family had always been successful, but the past 5 years had elevated them to true wealth: oil investments, tech stocks, real estate speculation, and most importantly grandfather's pharmaceutical empire that had made the family name synonymous with serious money in Los Angeles. "Isabella, you've been awfully quiet," Mom said from the head of the table, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted to include me in conversations but wasn't quite sure how. At 58, Elena Rodriguez was still stunning, her silver hair perfectly styled, her designer dress hugging a figure maintained by the best personal trainers money could buy. "Just enjoying the view," I replied, gesturing toward the city sprawling below us. "It's beautiful up here." "It should be for what they charge," my stepfather Richard commented with a laugh. He'd married Mom 3 years ago, bringing his own considerable fortune from construction and development to merge with the Rodriguez money. At 62 he was everything Mom had been looking for after Dad's death: successful, stable and completely devoted to her happiness. "Richard, don't be crude," Mom chided gently, though she was smiling. "Some things are worth paying for. Like family celebrations," added my stepsister Victoria, raising her mimosa glass in a toast. At 35 Victoria was everything I wasn't: polished, connected, and married to a hedge fund manager who treated money like a renewable resource. Here's to Mom's 58th birthday and many more years of celebrating together. The toast was echoed around the table, 40 voices raising in unison to celebrate the woman who'd somehow managed to build bridges between two very different families. The Rodriguez clan on one side, my uncles, aunts and cousins who'd built their fortune in pharmaceuticals and real estate. The Morrison family on the other, Richard's children and grandchildren who'd made their money in construction and finance. And then there was me, sitting at the intersection of both families but somehow belonging to neither. "Isabella, how's your little nonprofit work going?" asked my step-aunt Patricia, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy people use when discussing charity work, admiring but slightly condescending. "Still helping those underprivileged children with their reading programs?" Before I could answer, my stepbrother Marcus jumped in with a laugh. "Isabella's always been our family philanthropist. While the rest of us are making money, she's giving it away to worthy causes." The comment drew polite laughter from around the table, the kind of amused chuckling that happens when family members discuss the one relative who chose social work over profit margins. "It's important work," Mom said loyally, though her tone suggested she wished I'd chosen something more lucrative. "Not everyone needs to focus on making money." "Of course not," agreed my stepmom Victoria Sr., Richard's ex-wife who'd somehow remained part of family gatherings despite their divorce. At 55 she commanded attention with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about anything more serious than which charity gala to attend. Some people are called to service rather than success. The distinction wasn't lost on anyone at the table. Service versus success. Helping others versus helping yourself. The noble path for people who couldn't handle the real world of business and profit. "Though it must be difficult," continued Victoria Sr., cutting her smoked salmon with surgical precision, "supporting yourself on a non-profit salary. Especially in Los Angeles where everything is so expensive." "I manage," I said quietly, though I could feel heat rising in my cheeks. "Of course you do, dear. You've always been resourceful. Living simply, making do with less. It's actually quite admirable." The backhanded compliment landed like a slap. Around the table, family members nodded approvingly at this assessment of my modest lifestyle and noble poverty. "She's always been our little social warrior," added Uncle Roberto, Mom's brother who'd parlayed his pharmaceutical background into a billion-dollar empire. Even as a child, Isabella was more concerned with helping others than building wealth. "It's a beautiful quality," said my cousin Maria, though her diamond tennis bracelet caught the light as she gestured, undermining the sincerity of her words. "Not everyone can be motivated by material success." The conversation was starting to feel like a public dissection of my life choices, with 40 family members analyzing my supposed inability to achieve financial success. I took a sip of my mimosa and tried to stay focused on Mom's happy expression rather than the pity in everyone else's eyes. "The important thing," said Victoria Sr., her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when making pronouncements about family matters, "is that Isabella has found her purpose, even if it's not traditionally successful." "Absolutely," agreed Richard, cutting into his steak with obvious satisfaction. "Family is about supporting each other regardless of our different paths in life." "Speaking of family," Victoria Sr. continued, setting down her fork and addressing the table with the gravity of someone making an important announcement, "I think this birthday celebration is a perfect time to discuss something that's been on my mind." The conversations around the table began to quiet as attention focused on her. Victoria Sr. had a way of commanding attention when she wanted to make a point, and her tone suggested this was going to be significant. "Richard and I may be divorced, but we've remained close for the sake of our children and grandchildren," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the terrace. "And Elena, you've been wonderful about including my family in these celebrations." Mom smiled graciously, though I could see a hint of wariness in her eyes. Victoria Sr.'s pronouncements were usually preludes to uncomfortable conversations. "However," Victoria Sr. continued, "I think it's important that we all understand the difference between chosen family and blood family, especially when it comes to matters of inheritance and legacy." The word, inheritance, seemed to electrify the table. Conversations stopped entirely as 40 pairs of eyes focused on Victoria Sr., suddenly very interested in whatever point she was about to make. "What do you mean?" asked my cousin David, his attorney instincts apparently triggered by the mention of legal matters. "I mean that while we all love Isabella and appreciate her dedication to charity work, we need to be realistic about family dynamics and financial planning." My stomach began to sink as I realized where this conversation was heading. "Isabella is Elena's stepdaughter," Victoria Sr. continued, her voice taking on the clinical tone of someone explaining legal facts. "She's not a blood relative of the Rodriguez family, and she's not legally related to the Morrison family. She's family by marriage only." The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel 40 pairs of eyes turning to look at me, measuring my reaction to this public reminder of my outsider status. "Victoria," Mom said carefully, "what exactly are you trying to say?" "I'm saying that when it comes to inheritance matters, family wealth, business succession, estate planning, we need to be clear about who has legitimate claims and who doesn't." The words hit me like physical blows. I'd been part of this family for 15 years. Ever since Mom married my adoptive father when I was 17. I'd attended every family gathering, celebrated every milestone, supported every family member through crises and celebrations. And now Victoria Sr. was announcing to 40 people that I wasn't really family at all. "You're not real family," Victoria Sr. said, her eyes meeting mine directly. "The inheritance is for blood relatives only. That's just the reality of estate law and family responsibility." The pronouncement hung in the air like poison gas. Around the table, family members shifted uncomfortably, some nodding in agreement, others looking embarrassed by the public nature of the discussion. "That seems unnecessarily harsh," said Uncle Roberto, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely disagreeing with the sentiment. "It's not harsh, it's realistic," Victoria Sr. replied. "Isabella is a lovely girl and we all care about her, but she's not entitled to Rodriguez or Morrison family wealth. She has no blood connection to either family." "She's my daughter," Mom said firmly, though her voice carried a defensive edge that suggested even she wasn't entirely sure of her ground. "She's your stepdaughter," Victoria Sr. corrected. "There's a difference, especially when it comes to legal matters and inheritance rights." I felt my phone buzzing in my purse but ignored it, too mortified by the public discussion of my family status to care about whoever was calling. "Besides," Victoria Sr. continued, apparently warming to her theme, "Isabella has chosen a path of service rather than success. She's dedicated her life to helping others instead of building wealth. Surely she wouldn't want to benefit from the financial success of family members who made different choices." The logic was twisted but effective. She was using my supposed commitment to nonprofit work as evidence that I shouldn't benefit from family wealth, turning my career choice into a disqualification from inheritance consideration. That's not really the point, said my cousin Anna, speaking up for the first time. Family is family regardless of career choices. But is she really family? Victoria Sr. asked pointedly. She's not Elena's biological daughter. She's not legally adopted by Richard. She has no blood connection to the Rodriguez pharmaceutical fortune or the Morrison construction empire. What exactly makes her family besides social convenience? The question was brutal in its directness. I felt tears beginning to form behind my eyes as 40 family members considered whether I actually belonged at their table. My phone was buzzing insistently now, but I was too humiliated to check it. Whatever call I was missing couldn't be more important than this public dismantling of my family status. Isabella has been part of this family for 15 years, Mom said, her voice getting stronger. She's my daughter in every way that matters. Sentiment is lovely, Elena, but it doesn't change legal reality, Victoria Sr. replied smoothly. When it comes to estate planning and inheritance, blood relations and legal adoptions matter. Social relationships don't. Are you suggesting that Isabella shouldn't inherit anything from our family? Asked Uncle Roberto, his business instincts apparently kicking in. I'm suggesting that we need to be realistic about inheritance planning, Victoria Sr. said. The Rodriguez pharmaceutical empire is worth billions. The Morrison Construction Company is worth hundreds of millions. That wealth should stay within the actual family bloodlines. The numbers she was throwing around made several family members nod approvingly. Billions and hundreds of millions were serious money, the kind of generational wealth that families fought wars to protect. Isabella has never expected to inherit family wealth, I said quietly, finding my voice for the first time in the conversation. Of course not, Victoria Sr. said with false kindness. You're too noble for that. You've chosen service over success, charity over profit. Surely you wouldn't want to compromise those values by benefiting from capitalist wealth accumulation. The trap was perfectly laid. Either I agreed with her assessment and excluded myself from any inheritance consideration, or I contradicted my supposed commitment to social causes by expressing interest in family wealth. That's not fair, said my stepsister Victoria, looking uncomfortable with her mother's aggressive tactics. Isabella is part of this family. She's part of our social circle, Victoria Sr. corrected. But she's not part of our bloodline or our legal family structure. There's a difference. My phone was vibrating so insistently now that several people were looking at my purse with curiosity. Whatever was happening, it was urgent enough to override my embarrassment. Excuse me, I said, pulling out my phone to silence it. Oh, by all means, Victoria Sr. said with exaggerated courtesy. Perhaps it's one of your non-profit clients needing assistance. Don't let our family discussion interrupt your charitable work. The sarcasm in her voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. I glanced at my phone screen and saw 12 missed calls from my lawyer, my accountant, and several numbers I didn't recognize. Before I could process what the calls might mean, my phone rang again. The caller ID showed Harold Weinstein Askew, my lawyer's number. I should take this, I said, though I was reluctant to have a private conversation in front of 40 family members who were already dissecting my life. Of course, dear, Victoria Sr. said grandly. We'll wait while you handle your little emergency. I swiped to answer the call, and Harold's excited voice immediately filled the air through the phone's speaker, loud enough for the entire table to hear. Isabella. Thank God you answered. I've been trying to reach you for hours. The probate is complete. The words seemed to echo across the terrace. 40 family members suddenly went very still, their attention shifting from their mimosas to my phone conversation. Harold, I said carefully, you're on speaker. Could we? Perfect. Then everyone can hear the incredible news, Harold interrupted, his voice crackling with excitement. The Blackwood estate probate has been finalized. You now own the entire estate, all assets, properties, investments, and business holdings. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear traffic from the street below and the distant sound of kitchen staff working in the restaurant. The entire estate? I repeated weakly. Every single asset, Harold confirmed enthusiastically. The pharmaceutical patents alone are worth $4.7 billion. The real estate portfolio includes properties in 12 countries valued at over $2 billion. The investment accounts total another $3.8 billion. The numbers seemed to hit the table like physical blows. Victoria Sr.'s fork clattered to her plate with a sound like breaking glass. Harold, I said desperately, perhaps we could discuss this privately. Isabella, you're now worth over $12 billion, Harold continued, oblivious to the family drama he was destroying. You're officially one of the wealthiest women in America. The Blackwood pharmaceutical empire is yours. $12 billion. The number hung in the air like a golden elephant that nobody could quite process. Blackwood Pharmaceuticals? Uncle Roberto whispered, his face going pale. You inherited the Blackwood empire? Who is Blackwood? Asked my cousin Maria, though her voice suggested she was afraid of the answer. Harold's voice continued through the speaker, completely unaware that he was systematically destroying every assumption my family had made about my life. Of course, this doesn't include the charitable foundation assets, he said cheerfully. The Blackwood Foundation that you've been running has assets worth another $8 billion, making it one of the largest private foundations in the world. The foundation I'd been running. Not working for, not volunteering with. Running. You run the Blackwood Foundation? Mom asked, her voice barely audible. I've been running it for 5 years, I said quietly. Since Mrs. Blackwood passed away and left me everything. Left you everything? Victoria Sr. repeated, her voice cracking like old leather. Why would she leave you everything? Because I was her granddaughter, I said simply. The revelation hit the table like a nuclear bomb. 40 family members stared at me as if I'd just announced I was actually an alien wearing a human disguise. Granddaughter. Richard managed to croak. My biological father was Margaret Blackwood's son, I explained, the secret I'd kept for 15 years finally spilling out. He died in a car accident when I was 2. My mother, my biological mother, died of cancer when I was 16. That's when I went into foster care, and that's where Mom found me. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place in their minds. I watched my family process the information, their faces cycling through shock, disbelief, and dawning comprehension. So when I married Elena and adopted Isabella, Richard said slowly, I was actually adopting the heir to the Blackwood pharmaceutical fortune? You didn't adopt me, I corrected gently. You offered to, but I was already 17 and planning to go to college. We decided informal adoption was sufficient for family purposes. Harold's voice continued through the speaker, completely unaware of the family crisis he was creating. Isabella, the board of directors is meeting tomorrow to discuss the transition of power, he said. As the sole owner of Blackwood Industries, you'll need to decide whether to maintain current management or make changes. Sole owner? David asked, his lawyer brain struggling to process the implications. Mrs. Blackwood's will was very specific, Harold explained. Everything goes to Isabella. The pharmaceutical company, the research facilities, the patent portfolio, the real estate holdings, the investment accounts, and the charitable foundation. Everything, Anna repeated numbly. The pharmaceutical patents alone generate over $2 billion annually in licensing fees, Harold continued. Isabella, you're not just wealthy, you're going to be earning billions every year for the rest of your life. Victoria Sr. was staring at me like I'd just sprouted wings and started speaking in tongues. Her face had gone through several color changes before settling on a pale green that suggested nausea. This is impossible, she whispered. Actually, it's quite straightforward, Harold said cheerfully. Isabella has been managing the foundation and preparing for this transition for 5 years. Mrs. Blackwood spent her final years training Isabella to take over the family empire. 5 years? Mom asked weakly. Mrs. Blackwood contacted me when I turned 25, I explained. She'd been looking for her son's daughter since he died. When she found me, she brought me into the family business gradually. The non-profit work, Uncle Roberto said, understanding beginning to dawn on his face. You weren't working for small charities. You were running the Blackwood Foundation. The largest private foundation in America, Harold confirmed through the speaker. Isabella has been overseeing the distribution of $800 million annually to charitable causes worldwide. $800 million annually. The number seemed to break something in Victoria Sr.'s brain. She was staring at me like I was a completely different species than she'd previously assumed. But you live so modestly, Patricia said weakly. Your apartment, your car, your clothes. I prefer modest living, I said simply. Money doesn't have to define your lifestyle. Modest living? Harold laughed through the speaker. Isabella, you own houses in 12 countries and a private jet. You just prefer to use the corporate apartment in LA for convenience. The revelations kept coming like waves against a seawall. Each new piece of information seemed to further erode my family's understanding of who I actually was. Private jet. Victoria Sr. croaked. The foundation requires extensive travel for site visits and donor meetings, I explained. It's more efficient than commercial flights. Isabella, Harold continued, the transition ceremony is scheduled for next month. The business press is calling it the largest inheritance transfer in pharmaceutical history. Business press? Marcus asked numbly. Forbes, Fortune, Wall Street Journal, Harold listed cheerfully. They're all running cover stories about Isabella becoming the youngest female pharmaceutical heiress in history. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here were 40 family members who'd spent the morning discussing my lack of success and inheritance rights, learning that I was about to become one of the most powerful businesswomen in America. Harold, I said finally, I need to call you back. I'm at a family gathering. Of course. Congratulations again, Isabella. Mrs. Blackwood would be so proud to see her granddaughter finally taking her rightful place as head of the family empire. The line went dead, leaving 40 family members staring at me in complete silence. Victoria Sr. was the first to speak, her voice barely audible. You're worth $12 billion? As of about an hour ago, apparently. And you've been running an $8 billion foundation? For 5 years, yes. While we thought you were working for small local charities? You never asked what foundation I worked for. You assumed it was small and local. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming in the restaurant below and the distant sound of helicopters over the city. Isabella, Mom said, tears beginning to form in her eyes, why didn't you tell us? When would I have told you? I asked gently. During conversations about my lack of career success? While you were explaining why I couldn't afford expensive family vacations. While Victoria Sr. was announcing that I wasn't real family and had no inheritance rights. The questions hit the table like accusations. I watched my family grapple with the reality of their behavior, with the knowledge that they'd spent 15 years treating a pharmaceutical heiress like a charity case. We had no idea, Richard said, his voice breaking slightly. You had no idea because you never asked, I corrected. You made assumptions based on my lifestyle choices and never bothered to look deeper. But why live so modestly if you have access to billions? Asked Maria. Because money isn't everything. Because I wanted to see if my family could love me for who I am rather than what I'm worth. Because I wanted to use my wealth to help others rather than impress people. The weight of 15 years of assumptions was finally being lifted, and it felt both liberating and exhausting. The inheritance, Victoria Sr. said weakly. You said inheritance was for blood relatives only. It is, I agreed. The Blackwood fortune stays in the Blackwood bloodline. Which happens to be me. So you don't need Rodriguez or Morrison family wealth. I never did. I have more money than our entire extended family combined. The realization seemed to hit them like a physical force. Here they'd been debating whether the family failure deserved to inherit from their modest millions, while she was sitting on billions they'd never even dreamed of. Isabella, Uncle Roberto said, his business mind finally engaging with the implications. What does this mean for the family? It means that the granddaughter you thought wasn't real family is now one of the most powerful women in America, I said simply. But what does it mean for us? Victoria Sr. asked, though her voice suggested she was afraid of the answer. I looked around the table at these 40 people who had just spent the morning explaining why I didn't belong in their family, why I had no inheritance rights, why I wasn't successful enough to warrant their respect. It means that maybe it's time to reconsider what makes someone real family, I said quietly. We're so sorry, Mom said, reaching across the table toward me. All of us. We never meant to make you feel unwelcome. Didn't you? Because about an hour ago Victoria Sr. announced to 40 people that I wasn't real family and had no right to family inheritance. The accusation hung in the air like a sword. I watched my family grapple with the knowledge that they'd publicly humiliated someone who could now buy and sell their entire social circle. What happens now? Asked Victoria Sr., her voice small and broken. I considered the question, looking out over the city where I now owned more real estate than most corporations. How you know the truth, I said. The question is what you do with it. We want to do better, Richard said immediately. All of us. I hope so, I said, standing up from the table. Because despite everything, I still love this family. But I won't tolerate being treated like an outsider anymore. As I walked away from the table, I heard Victoria Sr. call out behind me, Isabella, wait. Where are you going? To my office, I said without turning around. I have a pharmaceutical empire to run. The rooftop terrace fell silent behind me as 40 family members sat in the wreckage of their assumptions, finally understanding that the family member they'd dismissed as a charity case was actually the most successful person any of them had ever met. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start rebuilding our relationships on honest foundations instead of false assumptions about worth, success, and what it really means to be family.